All right, we're starting just a minute past the hour. My name is Inger Stark, and I am one of the Peralta Equity Team members. And I'm here to welcome all of you to the last session of the first day of our conference, our online equity conference. And we are a couple of housekeeping matters. One is you will see under the bottom of your screen your ability to turn on your closed captions. Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong. I also wanted to say that Kevin is extremely skilled at running a workshop and also managing the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat and put links and information there and answer questions, but he's very skilled at doing his presentation and that as well. I want to encourage you to put questions and comments there. Since it's very late in the day, we may be a small group, which makes the interaction better. And then my last thing to do is something I've been looking forward to all day, which is to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kevin Kelly, who has been an integral part of Peralta's online equity initiative and team and has become a good friend and colleague. And so with a warm heart, I introduce what I expect to be one of our best sessions despite being at the end of the day. So Kevin, I turn it over to you with that.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. I have to not only live up to the hype, but I have to watch the chat too. So everybody should know that this is the first time I've given this presentation. I've given stuff like it before, but the context is that, as Inger mentioned, I've been working with Peralta Community College District since 2017. I have been fortunate to be working with them for 4 full years now. And one of the first things we did after my original assignment, which was to help them move from Moodle to Canvas learning management systems. The next set of projects we worked on was to create the first ever distance education plan. And we, as a group, decided that the core values that they wanted to underpin this plan, that would be 3 years in progress, would be the learners and equity. And when we first looked at what equity means in the dictionary, it means the shortest definition in Webster's is freedom from bias, period. And we didn't feel that was enough. It didn't encompass the online learning challenges that we feel our students face. And so we expanded the definition, and I think Inger is right in saying we use the term to mean as opposed to redefine freedom from biases, assumptions, and institutional barriers that negatively affect students' motivation, opportunities, and achievements. And so you've already heard from the first session today and moving throughout, even John back at 1 o'clock was talking about the Peralta rubric. So most of you probably have heard of it. If not, Inger, it would be fantastic if you could pop the link in the chat. But the rubric is built around research that shows either some equity-based challenges that negatively impact students' ability to succeed or complete online courses. So these biases, assumptions, institutional barriers show up in different ways. Technology, bias itself, a lack of meaning. Students can't see the meaning in the content on a personal level, and more. Because I was the person who was assigned to do the research, dive through the literature and find not just good ideas from armchair quarterbacks, but actual studies that showed that these things, when implemented, improve student success to reduce these equity barriers or remove them. And the negative side, these are the things we've identified that negatively impact student learning. We created the rubric from that, but I also started churning in my brain because I can't stop it from moving. Lenny Lind, thank you, gave me the metaphor of the hamster on the cage. So I started thinking about one of the criteria that we incorporated in the rubric itself, which is universal design for learning. And if you're familiar with the guidelines for Universal Design for Learning, it has 3 different ways of looking at the world: the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. But are all predicated around providing students with multiple ways to do things, whether it be to engage with other students, to make meaning from the materials that they're given, and to show what they know. And so these checkpoints, the bullets in each of these little sections of this grid, is a way to organize research that the CAST group, the Center for Applied Science and Technology, I believe it's called, or Special Technology, they put this together as a way to organize the way we think about these different principles. And so heading back to the research that I sifted through, hundreds of articles, I came up with a similar structure that I'm calling the Design for Learning Equity Framework, that is not meant to repeat UDL, but complement it. And I'll come back to this slide in a second, but I want to show you that if you imagine on the bottom there, a Canvas course tile, and then you're viewing that tile through the lens of Universal Design for Learning in the middle there, and then you add the layer of Design for Learning Equity, then we get a way of making our courses better piece by piece. It's a complementary or augmentative system rather than one or the other is better. And so I used some of the ideas from the UDL guidelines, and you can see that I kept the term access because it's a very big aspect of the rubric that we put together. But I also added in equity concepts, connection, and belonging as categories that expand beyond what the UDL guidelines ask us to do. Further, UDL focuses heavily on the way the brain works. And I wanted to focus more on how teaching and learning work. So rather than looking at multiple means of representation, engagement, and action and expression, I framed this in the way we often look at courses. But amazingly, it lines up very well with the UDL guidelines. So when we think about how we engage our students, when we think about how we ask them to review content, and when we think about how we assess their learning or ask them to assess themselves, that all becomes part of this matrix. And I'm going to walk us through each of these little grids because I came up with my own checkpoints that I pulled out of the literature, and we're going to explore it together. And it's a work in progress. So I'm hoping that in the chat, you'll all come up with other checkpoints that need to be on my list. But my goal is to launch this. I actually signed up to give this presentation to force myself to get this on paper because it's been in my head for literally 3 years. And I even wrote a book that launched this year that talks about this framework, but nobody's ever seen it. So you, the mighty few, are the first to ever see this officially outlined in the history of the world. So we look at that first column of engagement and we cross engagement with access. The literature shows, thanks for that link, Inger, that we need to humanize the environment where engagement takes place to provide students not only with a physical access, but a sense of this is something that where they are valued and is free of bias. So the 3 checkpoints that I've pulled in here from different sources, establishing a humanized instructor presence, humanizes that environment and gives students more access and motivation to engage with other students. Also helping students see that you value diversity, perhaps through a diversity statement in your syllabus, perhaps in the way you write the instructions for your activities. All of those things are important. And in some ways, when I work with my students, I also will reach out to individuals who may not be participating in a discussion or may not be participating in a group activity, and first check in with them, because I realize some people don't participate in those because they're choosing between other priorities like life and academics, and that's okay. But I don't want the reason for them not to participate to be predicated on they don't feel that their perspective is important. They don't feel that it's a diverse enough approach to the conversation or activity. And so I make individual outreach whenever I can. And then last but not least, we talk about implicit bias, and there are many kinds of bias. There's a whole wheel of biases that somebody showed in a recent presentation that I need to go find. But sometimes the way we write our prompts for engagement may be skewed toward certain types of individuals, extroverts, or native English speakers, or other ways that we can make assumptions or let our biases run free. Yale Center for Teaching and Learning, I love the fact that they include such a bias as we sometimes assume that students know that they should reach out for help when they need it and know where to reach out for help when they need it, especially when they are thrown online in the emergency remote teaching and learning world we find ourselves in. So that's the first box of the grid. And after each column, I'm going to entreat you all to share ideas about other items that might be considered for this matrix. The next item, if we cross engagement with connection, is looking at that social or human connection aspect of the learning process. And so one thing that we can do is we can require interaction among students that not only deepens learning, but also strengthens personal connections among those students. So going beyond a prompt that says, reply to 2 other students, but maybe asking them to reply to 1 student with whom you agree and reply to 1 student with whom you disagree. And for the students where you do agree, find a resource that they haven't considered, help them move above and beyond where they've already gone with their arguments or their ideas. For a student that you may not disagree, that you may not agree with, ask questions to understand where they're coming from, either to help them identify maybe literature that will support their own arguments that you haven't seen, or basically to gain a better understanding. We can also, another type of bias in the engagement scene is what's called human interaction bias. And there's a great study out of Stanford from 2018 now that shows that no matter what your demographic characteristics are as an instructor, in their study, all of those instructors were 94% more likely to reply first and sometimes only to names in the discussion forum that look like white male names. So me, Kevin Kelly, I would get replies from a teacher in this study very frequently, and others, maybe Inger because she's female, or others would not get the same amount of attention. When I saw that research, I flipped out a little bit because I teach a class of 50 to 100 students every semester. And I said, am I doing that? And so I actually created a Google spreadsheet. And in one column, I have my course roster. And then every column after that is one of the discussions in our class. And I put a little initial, KK, next to the student's name for each discussion when I've given them feedback. And I tell the students in my syllabus that I am focused on equity. I cannot reply to 100 students every week, but my goal is to make sure that all students get the same amount of feedback from me, the instructor, across the semester. And I try to spread it out evenly, because if I wait 7 weeks to reply to one of my students, they're going to be demotivated to ever put something in that discussion ever again. Even though it's worth points, they're not getting feedback from their fellow students. They're not getting feedback from the instructor. Why do it? So that human interaction bias is real. And so we can take steps to counteract it. And then the last bullet in this category is connecting students to appropriate resources and services at a distance. And so in the instructions for activities, we're all very good at, well, most of us are really good at putting in our syllabus, hey, here are these resources. Here's a tutoring center. Here's a tech help desk, all those different things. But I am advocating that we consider how to connect students with those resources on an assignment by assignment basis, that we also consider things that might not be academic in scope. Right now, especially during the pandemic, students' stress levels and anxiety levels are extremely high, which impacts their ability to learn. And so how do we help them find health and wellness that might be either related to the topics we're discussing or just as a safety valve for them to be able to find ways to address that stress so they can get back to engaging with their fellow students. I have to tell you, the most eye-opening activities I've done in order to better understand how students think about this is focus groups and surveys. And so I've been involved in a couple of different statewide initiatives where we're talking to students. One student will say, hey, the reason why many of us don't reply in discussions is because we don't want to look foolish in front of our peers. So how do we find ways to reduce that anxiety of being wrong by saying it's okay to be wrong? Actually, we want you to be wrong because that's how we learn, by making mistakes and giving them a backup. So when we use techniques in the classroom to manage human interaction bias, one of those techniques is to use index cards with every student's name on it. And instead of calling on the frequent talkers or the people who are first to raise their hand, you just take the first card off the top and say, Inger, this question's for you. And then if Inger doesn't know the answer, then I can say, Anita, you're next in the stack. Can you help Inger with her response? What is she missing? And you work through the stack a little bit like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Phone a Friend, if you remember that old show. So thinking about ways that we can manage that bias, but also connect students to appropriate resources are ways that we can think about the equity of the connections we're asking students to make with each other and with us, the instructor. Last in this column of engagement, when we cross engagement and belonging, then we can see strategies where we're encouraging individual participation, which I mentioned before, showing that it's valued for and by all students. And we can do that individually, but we can also do that publicly, sometimes by sending out a midweek motivation email message that pulls from the discussion. Hey, did you all see this great quote in the discussion? Fantastic thinking by so-and-so. That's a way that you can encourage participation because students see that you're reading it and you're acknowledging it, you're recognizing their work. Also by demonstrating caring. And one way that I have completely radically changed my own teaching is by a small tweak. When I send individual emails to those students who have not logged in for 7 to 10 days or more, my original approach 5-10 years ago would be to take an administrative tone, deadline approaching, make sure you do the work kind of statements. Now the title of the email is, "Are you okay?" ? And then the first paragraph says, hey, I know it's a busy time of the semester. I know 80% of the students at San Francisco State work at least half time. I know you may be taking care of family, whether it be your own children, your parents, or others. I just want to make sure that if you wanted to do this assignment, you have everything you need to succeed. Let me know. We can talk through it. Let's create a plan. When I sent out the administrative emails, I would get 1 in 10 response rate. When I started showing that I cared about them as human beings, I would get 7 in 10 response rate. So definitely students value having teachers that care. And lately, in the last couple semesters during the pandemic, students have been either writing it in their evaluations of the course. In one case, a student embedded a 1-paragraph thank you in his final essay, maybe to make sure that we were reading the final essays completely through. I don't know, but it was nice to find that little Easter egg in the essay. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to encourage you all, and I'm going to see the chat. I see Inger made a comment, to think through engagement, how you engage people in any learning situation, whether it be campus class, whether it be an organizational development meeting, wherever you are, where you want to engage people, share some ideas where we might increase the equity in that experience. And those may end up as bullets on the Design for Learning Equity framework, and I'll give you credit. And while you're thinking through your ideas, Inger says, as a frequent talker myself, I'd be cool with an instructor creating more airspace for other students. Absolutely. Absolutely. The challenge is I'm the teacher and a frequent talker, so I have to create that airspace by zipping my lip. And since we're a small group, if people would rather say it out loud rather than type it in the chat, I'm okay with that as well. Inger has a raised hand.
As a frequent talker, Aura, I know you were at the last session with Michelle Pakinski-Brock, and Kevin knows her well. But Kevin, your section on humanizing goes really well and fits nicely with the material, some of the research and material that Michelle presented in the last one about caring and kindness, and how she talks about research about what kindness is and how expressing that to your students brings them in. And as I was looking at your sort of matrix, I was thinking about how those two things really, really overlap a lot.
Mm-hmm. And when we get to the assessment column, I'm pretty confident that the presentation that Michelle and others gave last summer about being a warm demander, which goes back to the 70s, the literature there, that will resonate as well. But yes, and I think that some of the research I found is Michelle's. So no surprise there that there are synchronicity going on. All right, so in the spirit of moving forward, the next column, when we talk about how we ask students to review the content of our courses. Jill, I'm glad you are a fan of being a warm demander, and I'll define it when we get there. Oh, look at this. Lori says, I'm the PD coordinator at my college, and all of these ideas transfer to how we do PD. Absolutely. It's not just for classes, or as the commercial said, orange juice is not just for breakfast anymore. These concepts around equity expand to the whole environment of our campuses. And Inger even brought up, I think it was in the post session of the very first panel, that I've been working on an institution level rubric, so that we think about how we can apply equity concepts to the student journey that's outside of the course experience. How do we help them with the registration process through advising? How do we help them with financial aid? How do we help them with psychological services? How do we help them find food? All these different aspects of the student journey, whether it be online or face-to-face, we still run into equity issues. Do students see themselves on the campus website as opposed to the materials for your course? Something we're going to talk about on this slide. I was just interviewing and doing focus groups with students in Colorado community colleges, and older students made the remark that they didn't know if the community college system was interested in them being students because they didn't see themselves in the pictures of students on the campuses. I know this is being recorded, and we'll have to substitute Colorado for another state. Let's call it Flibberty-Gibbet State. But that brings me to this. It's a great segue, Kevin. Thank you. When we cross content with access to students, again, it's not just physical access to the content, which may be supported by managing costs by using open educational resources and zero textbook cost materials. but also finding ways that they may feel a sense of access to the content. There is literature that shows that African-American students, if they don't see themselves in the course materials, they don't see people like them, they are less likely to retain, they're less likely to stay motivated to finish the reading or content review. And so that's a form of access, right? We're providing them access through keeping them motivated. They need to be able to see themselves. And this picture from the Lean In gallery on the Getty Images says it. You can't be it if you can't see it. I know that was a popular phrase when Madam Vice President was elected this past fall, that young girls felt that now they could see themselves in leadership positions at the highest level because there was an image for them to see and reflect. So that means it's upon us to look through our textbooks, to look through the materials we ask students to consume, whether it be a video or infographic or what have you. And if we cannot change the images because we're not the publisher of the textbook, then we can either augment it or we can turn it into an assignment where we ask students, hey, I don't think these pictures reflect the diversity of our class. We're taking a business class and there are no women in leadership positions in these pictures. I want you all to go find pictures that reflect how you would like these concepts to be portrayed in our materials. And so you can do it yourself. You can ask for the students to support the process by engaging in it with you. Another way we can help is by making your course transparent. In the next assessment column, I'm going to talk about the transparent assignment template. Some of you may be familiar with that out of University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Marianne Winklemas and others put it together. And it looks at what students are supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it, but also why. And now the reason I bring it up here in the context of content is we need to let students know why they're reading this chapter of a textbook. What does it help them achieve? What is it going to prepare them to do? How are you going to take it one step further? Once you've read this, we're going to have a conversation where this is going to help you reach the learning outcome XYZ. So the transparent assignment template, I have blown up to be the course transparency template because I use it for everything, not just my content prompts, not just my assignments, but even the overview list of activities we're going to do each week. I use that what, why, and how framework to help students see what they're supposed to do. And that framework especially helps students who might be a first generation to go to college or other groups that can use that additional support. Last, and I know Universal Design for Learning talks about accessibility, but in their guidelines, they don't actually reference making sure your course materials are accessible directly. So I added it just to make sure we don't lose sight of that, even though a lot of people are already thinking about it. And I did go through this presentation and put alt tags for every picture. So I'm trying to live the life. When we talk about content and connection, how students gain that sense of personal connection to the content, then one strategy is to showcase multiple diverse perspectives on course topics. Here you can see the picture in the top right is actually instructions from an activity in my own class, where I ask students to first take a growth mindset survey and then review not just one person's perspective on the growth mindset, Carol Dweck, who came up with the concept with her colleagues, but 4 different concepts. Luke Wood from San Diego State, Angela Lee Duckworth, and Anindya Kundu have together a nice Venn diagram that shows different aspects of the growth mindset or factors that increase students' motivation to continue learning and despite the troubles they face. And we have fantastic conversations in my class where I ask students to let me know which perspective is the one they resonate most with, and to have Asian female say that she resonates most with Luke Wood, who's an African-American male, means that we can't make assumptions about what students are going to feel or think or believe. Next, supporting analysis and addressing the harm or impact of stereotypes and misrepresentations. And again, we can call students' attention to the mainstream media. We can call students' attention to the way our course materials that we may not have constructed may present stereotypes, but having conversations about it as well as pointing it out means that students become more adept at thinking about equity themselves because they are part of the process. And then when we cross content with belonging, how do we help show the connections that students can make between the assessments, the activities, the content to their own goals, their own futures, their own backgrounds, their own identities, or asking them to make those connections to the goals, identities, backgrounds of people not like them. And we can do this again by pointing these things out to the students, or we can ask the students to make those connections themselves. So again, I encourage you to share in the chat if you have any ideas, or unmute yourself and shout out some bullets that might be useful concepts to help increase learning equity when it comes to providing content for students to review. And while you think through that, I'm going to read through Monica's statement. I try to use multiple modes of sharing communication about each project we work on. Some prefer text, some talk in front of the others about their ideas, some record themselves, reach out to more passive participants and find something to ground an example from their perspective, and ask for a response to a directing prompt based on what's needed to get to the objective. Varied and personal, great. Matasha says, nothing new to add, but that's at this moment. I have a feeling that you all are gonna wake up in the morning and think of some great things to share on the Padlet board that Inger put in the chat at the very beginning. Yes, it does take mulling. And the fact that I looked through hundreds of articles means that I have more time to mull. If my name were Martin, I'd be an actor. All right, so I will let you all keep thinking through this idea of increasing learning equity for content. And I am going to hop into the last column, both feet first. And think about assessment and how we can increase learning equity for that. So when we cross assessment and access, I frame that as creating achievement pathways. Are we providing just-in-time, inline links to the appropriate support? And I referenced this a little bit earlier in a different context when we were talking about engagement. But if you're going to create an assignment where students need to do research, then in the instructions, you might want to have a little box at the bottom. If you need help with, contact librarians for research, the Writing Center for writing, tutors to get help with difficult concepts in physics, chemistry, math, whatever. Having those links, again, not just in your syllabus, but right there in the instructions so students can click it. They don't have to work as hard to go get the help. Again, that assumption I brought up from Yale Center for Teaching and Learning earlier was not just a random pick, because they have several assumptions listed on their website. But it is easy for us to assume that students know they should seek help when they need it and know where they should go to get it. And just because it was something that they may have briefly seen in a syllabus on week 1 of the semester does not mean when they're doing their final project in week 15, they're going to remember all that stuff and remember to go to the syllabus, especially first generation students who may not have that much experience with syllabi in the first place. Now, providing alternative technology paths for students to demonstrate achievement is another way to provide access. And so here's a great example. I teach a class called How to Learn with Your Mobile Device. And it's a general education course. And early in my career, young fool that I was. Now I'm an old fool, but young fool that I was, I asked students, because they were submitting their work in every format known to humankind. They were submitting open source document formats and Apple Pages, which I didn't have the application because I was on a Mac and a PC at the time, and Word and all these different. So I said, hey, I don't mind you using whatever you need to create these papers, but please save it as a PDF so I can open it. Almost immediately, a student emailed me back and said, teacher, this class is called How to Learn with Your Mobile Device. I'm living in my car right now, and I have no way to save papers as a PDF. Matter of fact, it's hard for me to write papers at all. And I, again, like that interaction bias, my immediate reaction was, oh my God, I just created a barrier for students. So I said, okay, I sent out an immediate email again, reverse course students, create your papers in whatever you can, and I will figure it out. And for that particular student, there's a couple options. One, if you want to type with your thumbs, you can use Google Docs. Just send me the link instead of creating a file. I said you can also park your car at the 24/7 computer lab. This is pre-pandemic. If you feel safe giving up your spot or safe parking in front of the library. And you can use the computers there to write your paper and send it in. Now that I'm older and wiser, I've also learned that there's a tool called Google Voice, where I can create a free phone number that does not rack up debt. And crank calls can call it all they want, but it's got a voicemail box. So then I can tell students, write your paper with pen and paper and read your essay to me. Just be clear so that I can understand the dictation, but I will use the same rubric to grade that paper as I do a written work. And so providing those alternative pathways for students to demonstrate achievement is a fantastic way to go. And we can go even further and think about different formats that we can ask students to use. So allow students to write an essay, but also to give a presentation. Allow students to write an essay, but also to create an infographic. If they can convey the same information, if you can use the same rubric to review it. Often what I do when I have multiple formats that students can submit, I ask them to write an outline with words first, because that helps structure the videos they create. I used to get 20-minute videos that rambled. Now I get 5-minute videos that stick to the points on the outline. Last but not least, managing cultural bias within our assessments. And again, that could take the form of questions from a publisher question bank that might be Eurocentric in nature. And if you have international students in your course, they will be at a disadvantage if they don't understand vocabulary that's used only in the States. So thinking about those different aspects. When we think of the column of assessment and crossing it with connection, we can increase the sense of connection by providing our feedback on their assessments using different media. And I like the idea of screencast videos as a way to give feedback about papers or projects or what have you. Providing opportunities for students to give each other feedback in small groups is a way to create that sense of connection in the assessment process. And again, owning that we are part of the process. And if we give them prompts like reply to 2 other students, we shouldn't be disappointed if they write good job, smiley face. We have to ask them to be thorough. We have to ask them if we want them to cite their sources. And if we want them to respect diversity or even seek out diversity, then we need to put that in the prompts that we ask them to reply to. And then last but not least, when we cross assessment with belonging, we have to think about how are we encouraging students to persist after our course is over, not just in the courses that follow our course, but in the discipline as a whole, especially let's say women in STEM classes people of color in STEM classes. At the institution, that sense of integration that Vincent Tinto talks about in his research, how can we build that into the assessment process so that students feel a sense of belonging? And again, it might be in the way we do prompts, it may be in the way we evaluate students or provide feedback, but it's, and referring to their personal goals as part of that feedback process is a great way to start. I know we're running low on time, so I'll ask you to hold your ideas for increasing learning equity in the assessment process, and just I'll open it up to any questions that you all have. And thank you for your time, for being here. At least on the West Coast is after hours, and for folks like Lenny and El Salvador, it's what, 7 p.m. or 6 p.m., something like that. So
just 1 hour.
Oh, just 1 hour. Okay, well then I take it back. Just kidding. So questions, comments, ideas, reactions.
Kevin, would you put the grid back up so we can look at it and comment on it?
You bet.
And I'll also comment, because Kevin may have forgotten to say this, but a link to his presentation slides will be available also after the events.
Correct.
I have a quick question. Maybe it's quick.
Please. It's
probably actually a lot more nuanced. In a lot of these treatments or solutions, I could use that. I work both as faculty and also support. And in my instructional support role, I get from faculty that much of this takes too much individual assessment time. So for example, being flexible on the kinds of output you'll allow for students to give you to be able to prove that they've come to a measurable objective. What tips do you give me as someone who wants to help faculty value the student perspective when they can rightfully say, I just don't have the lifetime to be able to give this? What do you say?
Well, first, I recommend that faculty consider a +1 mentality. If you've seen the book by Tom Tobin and Kirsten Bailing, they talk about picking just one thing that you can do to increase the universal design of your course. And in the same spirit, we can take that +1 mentality when it comes to increasing learning equity. So to take this whole matrix or framework and try to apply it to your course, that's a full course redesign that's going to take a long time. And it does imply maybe more work on the back end in the assessment process, the engagement process, or what have you. But if you pick one thing where you feel may have the biggest impact for your students, if you know you have a lot of English language learners, or if you know you have a lot of first generation students, pick the strategy that you think is going to increase that sense of success. And you may find that some of these things don't really increase the workload other than setting it up. So creating more descriptive prompts that encourage students to seek out students in a more diverse way than the first two that you see on the list of comments in a discussion forum. It's no extra time except for that initial thinking of how do we get students to be more critical, more equitable, all that stuff. So I would start there and say, just pick one thing. Great question.
Keep it simple.
And thanks, Inger. She put the link to the book, Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone. It's about universal design for learning.
Kevin, I have a couple of questions.
Please.
I love that you put diversity and meaning in the center. That's just perfect for me. So I guess I'm all about relationships today. What's the relationship between this model and the rubric, the Peralta rubric?
So the rubric is a way to operationalize some of this thinking because it gives you concrete ways to go through your course and review it with access in mind, universal design for learning in mind, connection and belonging in mind, bias. This to me is just a way to make that connection to the rest of the world. And so if you remember, I see it as one lens of several. And if you've been to the eye doctor, you know that they'll drop some lenses in front of your eye. Is it clear now or is it fuzzy? And so to me, we can start clarifying equity by thinking about multiple lenses that we need to be using. And ironically, I came up with this, and Universal Design for Learning, the group at CAST, has now started a UDL Rising project where they want to increase equity as part of their guidelines. And so I told them about this, but I hadn't put this presentation together. So now I'll have a recording to point them to. But when you ask the question, how does this kind of play with the rubric? You can see the rubric as a way to operationalize the framework. And it's just one way because it's organized a little differently and such, but it does include a lot of the things that I brought up.
I happen to have a copy right here, and I was going back and forth like this. And so my question was, are there content areas that are not 100% overlap between the two? Are there some things here that are really not referenced in the rubric? I'm trying to figure out how to use both.
Right. Well, that's actually a really good question. I'd have to take a look myself because I was involved in creating both. They blend in my mind a little bit, as one might imagine. I thinking through it, maybe aspects like the belonging and assessment connection in the bottom right corner might be something that's not as strongly emphasized in the rubric. But if you think about belonging throughout your entire course, then you're going to touch on assessment strategies. Inger's got her hand up and she probably can think of something.
I wanted to say, Anita, your question's really good because I've known that Kevin has been working on this particular framework. I would say that they're additive and they're conceptually different. So many of the fundamental concepts, engagement, connection, belonging, content are similar, but what Kevin's got here is a way where you actually are challenged then to see how two of those concepts come together, right, and create sort of you to think about them in a different way, where we have each of our criteria as a unique, independent criteria. I would suggest as you get more familiar with those criteria, then this actually makes it more complex and kind of takes it to a deeper level about how you see those different criteria connecting together and intersecting.
Super. That just, it just clicked when I saw that we're talking about relationships between two variables and how that transforms things. Of course, Kevin, you have a one-page description of each of these, right?
Well, I am building an entire website. It's just not ready yet. And I got the domain for $5 at godaddy.com. It's called learningequity.org. So keep your eyes open for it, but don't hold me to that because I'm running a conference.
I know, and you're doing a good job. Thank you.
But that's what I actually need, those nudges. So email me. I'll put my email in the box here.
Thank you.
Because it really helps to have knowing that people want to see it. That will drive me to get it done.
Super.
So a couple closing remarks. One is I don't know exactly how yet because Kevin and DDEM are the primary organizers of the conference, but you will have access to the recordings for all the conference events. I would not hope to see those until next week because we're all just swamped, especially Kevin and DDEM, until the end of Friday. Second, we can make sure that you'll get a copy of Kevin's slides. Then last, I just wanted to tell you, and Kevin's gonna be embarrassed when I say this, but I've been getting emails from him at 11 at night and early in the morning and texts, and he literally had to do all those things and you guys are the first folks to see this full presentation of this model, Hotels. And so I'm really excited because it is definitely going to take equity to a deeper level. So Kevin, I know how much you've been working and it's stunning that you just gave us this presentation. I'm really glad you threw down and made sure it happened because it's really important work and builds on top of what everybody else has been doing. I put a bunch of links in the chat to a bunch of resources he talked about. You can scroll back, a link to Kevin's book, which personally I think is phenomenal. It's one of the best handbooks for new faculty or any faculty really who are trying to say, there's just so much out there. What do I focus on as I'm building online instruction? And I hate to say this, Kevin, but as the primary organizer, what have I forgotten to say in closing?
That we hope that people will stay connected asynchronously. We've got the Padlet board, which Inger already pointed us to, but we also would love for people to find the Peralta Equity Initiative on social media. And we'll be using the website as the primary vector to get everything out to people. So the links to the recordings will be at least next week, because we have to go through and edit all the transcripts before we make them live to make sure they're accurate for people with accommodation needs. And so it's going to be a work in progress, but this conference is meant to foster a sense of community. So the same way that you all shared some great ideas in the chat, we hope you'll do the same on Padlet. We hope that you'll reach out to individuals like me and say, hey, that was really good. And you could also consider this, because that's what moves us all forward, is this working as a diverse group of individuals. We just happen to be lucky that there's 850 individuals working in this direction right now at this conference. So I'm grateful for your time, your thinking, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow for our discussions and on Friday for our workshops. Again, we're going to follow this staggered presentation format so that people can get work done, but also to accommodate people from different time zones. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Most people late in the day, but whatever. And you're right. Yeah. Thank you. And we'll hope, yeah, exactly, Lenny, right? We'll see you tomorrow, hopefully in different events, and see you on Friday.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Take care.